Somewhere in the high desert of eastern California, at an elevation where the wind never truly stops and the snow can fall in any month of the year, there is a town that the state of California officially describes as existing in a state of arrested decay. Not restored. Not preserved. Arrested. As if the decay itself had been caught in the middle of something it wasn't supposed to be doing, and frozen there. Mid-motion. Still reaching. The town is called Bodie. And between the years of 1877 and 1882, it was home to somewhere between 7 and 10,000 people, depending on which census taker you trusted. And the census takers in Bodie did not always last long enough to finish their counts. In those 5 years, the Bodie morgue processed more bodies per capita than any other settlement in California. The town had 1 church and 65 saloons. It had a red light district that operated 24 hours a day. It had a Chinatown, a Maiden Lane, a brewery, a slaughterhouse, a bank vault that was robbed so many times the lock was eventually welded shut rather than replaced. And it had a reputation, spread from San Francisco to Sacramento to the mining camps of Nevada, for being the kind of place where a man could arrive on Monday and be in the ground by Friday without anyone filing a report. Some of that reputation was exaggeration. Mining towns always cultivated a mythology of violence because violence attracted a particular kind of man, and those men spent money. But some of it, the parts that weren't written in the newspapers, the parts recorded only in coroners' logbooks and in the private letters of men who left Bodie quickly and never went back, some of it was worse than the reputation suggested. There were things that happened in Bodie that the official record buried, not because they were unimportant, but because they were inconvenient. Things that connected men of influence in ways that the men of influence could not afford to have connected. What we know today about Bodie is largely what was permitted to survive. Before we continue with the story of Bodie and what it actually cost to build, to break, and to bury, take a moment right now to subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. And while you're there, drop a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. We read every single one. Now let us go back to the beginning, not the beginning that appears in the tourist brochures, but the real one. The one that started not with gold, but with a man named Waterman Bodie, a blizzard, and a decision that should never have been made. The eastern Sierra Nevada in the late 1850s was not a place that invited settlement. The mountains there rise abruptly from the Great Basin, and the terrain between them, the high desert valleys, the alkali flats, the volcanic tablelands, has a quality of hostility that early settlers often described not as dangerous but as indifferent. The land didn't want to kill you. It simply didn't care whether you lived or died. And in that indifference, it killed many. The elevation at which Bodie would eventually sit 8,300 feet above sea level in the volcanic highlands east of the main Sierra Nevada crest meant that the seasons there were not the seasons that men from the eastern states or the European continent recognized. Winter arrived not in December but in October, sometimes in September. It did not depart until May, sometimes June. Snow did not come gently. It came sideways, driven by winds that had crossed hundreds of miles of open desert before arriving at the highlands with nothing left to stop them. The temperature in January could fall to 30 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit before accounting for the wind. There was no shelter in the landscape itself, no deep forests, no sheltering valleys. The terrain was high and flat and open. And whatever lived or tried to live on it did so in full exposure to whatever the sky decided to do. The Paiute people had lived in that region for centuries and understood its rhythms, where water could be found in summer, where game moved in winter, how to read the sky when the temperature dropped 40 degrees in an afternoon without warning. They called the volcanic highlands east of the Sierra by names that translated roughly to the place of difficult passage and where the wind has no mercy. These were not poetic designations. They were practical ones. The Paiute moved through this country with the knowledge of people who had learned over many generations which parts of it could sustain life and which parts could not. They knew, for instance, that the highland basin where Bodie would eventually stand was not a place to winter. They knew it because their ancestors had tried. And the ancestors had told their descendants what trying had cost. The men who arrived in the 1850s looking for gold did not speak Paiute. And most of them would not have listened if they had. William Bodie, the man whose name would eventually, through misspelling and misremembering, become the name of one of California's most notorious towns, arrived in the Mono Lake region in the summer of 1859. He was a prospector from Poughkeepsie, New York, which is to say he was a man who had spent most of his adult life chasing something just over the next ridge. He had been in California since 1849, following the original rush, and by 1859 he was 41 years old, trail-worn, and running low on both capital and patience. He had tried the rivers of the Mother Lode. He had tried the gravel bars of the American River and the Feather River and the Trinity. He had worked for wages in the hydraulic operations of the Northern Sierra and saved enough to strike out on his own again, and then lost that saving in a claim that yielded nothing. And had started again. Men like Bodie were the majority of the California mining population by the late 1850s, not the ones who had struck it rich in '49 and become legends, but the ones who had followed the legend and found only the diminishing returns of a rush that was already past its peak. He had partners, as most prospectors did, men whose names the historical record treated with less care than it treated Bodie's, which is to say they were remembered incompletely and then forgotten. One was a man called Black Taylor, who may or may not have been born into slavery and freed before reaching California, depending on which account you trusted. Another was a French Canadian whose name appears in some records as Dore and in others simply as the Frenchman. In late July of 1859, Bodie, Taylor, and Dore discovered placer gold in a ravine in the highlands about 80 miles north of Mono Lake. The amount was not spectacular. Enough to confirm the presence of a vein, not enough to make anyone immediately rich. But in the exhausted arithmetic of late-stage California prospecting, it was enough to matter. The color they found in the pan was consistent. The rock formation suggested something below the surface that the surface samples couldn't fully reveal. It was, in the language of the trade, a showing. A reason to look further. Bodie recorded the claim. He sent word south. He began making plans. He did not survive to execute them. In November of 1859, Bodie and a companion named Esk, a younger man recently arrived from Ohio who had attached himself to the party in the summer and proven himself willing if not particularly skilled, set out from their winter camp to retrieve supplies from a settlement in the valley below. They had put off the journey longer than they should have, waiting for a break in the weather that came briefly and then closed again before they reached safety. A storm came in from the north faster than either man anticipated. Esk survived by finding shelter in a stand of pinyon pines and building a fire from the deadfall around him, feeding it through the night while the wind brought the temperature down to levels that made breathing painful. Bodie did not. He was found the following spring, frozen, less than half a mile from camp. He had made it nearly far enough. The camp was visible from where they found him, a fact that everyone who subsequently told the story noted, because it had the quality of things that are true and terrible, rather than simply terrible. He was buried near the discovery site in an unmarked grave. His partners misspelled his name in the claim documents, whether by accident or by carelessness. And the place became Bodie, rather than Bode, a slight and meaningless distortion that somehow felt appropriate for a town that would spend the next 20 years distorting everything it touched. For almost 2 decades after Bodie's death, the claims in the highlands changed hands multiple times without yielding anything significant. Small operations came and went. Men staked, dug, gave up, moved on. The winters drove most operators out. The cost of supplying an operation at that elevation on roads that were impassable for 5 months of the year made the margins on low-grade ore impossible. Then, in 1876, a mine shaft collapsed. The Standard Mines operations had included, in the years before the collapse, a series of exploratory shafts driven into the hillside at various angles and depths. One of those shafts, the eastern one, had been driven deeper than the others, deeper than the budget had originally authorized, because the foreman on site, a practical man from Ohio named Gideon Fry who had 30 years of mining experience and no interest in the financial theories of men in San Francisco offices, had a feeling. The feeling was based on the color of the rock, the angle of the quartz intrusions, and the way the temperature dropped as you went deeper, which experienced miners used as an indicator of particular geological conditions associated, in that part of the Sierra, with high-grade ore. Frey's feeling turned out to be correct. The collapse of the eastern shaft in the autumn of 1876, a collapse that killed 2 men, a fact noted in the company's records and not dwelled upon, exposed in the rubble a vein of gold-bearing quartz that assayed values that made the company's owners go pale when they read the report. Not pale with fear, pale with the particular shock of sudden, almost incomprehensible wealth. The assay numbers were checked twice, because numbers like that were the kind of thing that happened in stories, not in the accounts of working mines in the California high desert. The numbers were confirmed. By the spring of 1877, the word was out, and the men began to arrive. In 1878, Bodie had a population of somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 people, and that number was growing by hundreds per month. The Standard Mine and the Bodie Mine were producing ore at rates that justified every superlative the San Francisco papers could manufacture. The Bodie Bank processed more gold dust in a single week that spring than some counties processed in a year. The town's commercial district on Main Street extended nearly half a mile, with wooden storefronts pressed so tightly together that a fire at one end would have consumed everything before a man could run to the other. They had 2 fires in 1878. Neither of them was the last. The town itself had the quality of a place that had grown faster than its bones could support. Streets existed because men walked through the same mud often enough that the mud developed ruts, and the ruts became roads, and the roads attracted buildings on either side without any plan or logic. The violence in Bodie during its peak years was not merely anecdotal. It was structural. The town had more than 60 establishments that sold alcohol. It had an opium trade, a gambling economy, and a floating population of men who had no stake in the community's future because they did not expect to remain long enough to have one. The justice system, such as it was, consisted of a sheriff whose jurisdiction was technically Mono County but who was physically located 30 miles away in Bridgeport, a town marshal who was replaced 8 times in 4 years for reasons ranging from corruption to incompetence to death, and a justice of the peace who held court in a room above a saloon, and whose rulings were occasionally enforced and occasionally not, depending largely on whether the defendant had friends who were better armed than the plaintiff's friends. To live in Bodie in 1878 was to exist in a condition of continuous low-level alarm. The sounds of the town at night, and the town had no real night, because the saloons ran until dawn and the mills ran around the clock, their stamps pounding the ore in a rhythm that those who lived in Bodie long enough stopped hearing, the way people stop hearing the clock in a room they've occupied too long, those sounds included, with a regularity that ceased to be remarkable, gunshots. Sometimes distant, sometimes close. Sometimes followed by shouting, by the sound of boots on wooden floors, by the particular quality of silence that followed sudden violence in a space full of men who were deciding whether to involve themselves or not. The newspapers of the era, both local and in San Francisco, covered Bodie's violence with something that looked, at a certain distance, like horror, but that was actually closer to commercial enthusiasm. Stories of shootings sold papers. Stories of robberies sold papers. The town had developed a reputation, cultivated, exaggerated, but rooted in enough truth to maintain itself as the most dangerous settlement in California, a designation that attracted a particular kind of man and repelled the kind of family that might have stabilized it. The particular story of a man named Patrick Fahey, which circulated through the California press in the summer of 1879, sold a great many papers, and then, with unusual speed, stopped being mentioned at all. Patrick Fahey was 34 years old in 1879. He had come to Bodie from Virginia City, Nevada, where he had worked as a shift supervisor in the Comstock mines long enough to save a sum of money that he then lost in a speculation that he ever after refused to discuss in detail. He arrived in Bodie in the spring of 1878 with nothing but his tools, his experience, and a reputation among mining men as someone who understood geology with an almost uncommon precision, the kind of man who could look at a rock face and describe what it was doing 50 feet beyond where the candle reached. He was, by the accounts of the few people who knew him in Bodie and who later spoke about him, a private man. He did not frequent the saloons except occasionally when the cold was particular and the rooming house was insufficiently warm. He did not gamble. He attended no church, by which, in 1878 Bodie, meant he attended the same institution as the majority of its residents. He was Irish, born in County Clare, raised in Philadelphia, shaped by the particular combination of Catholic sensibility and American practicality that characterized the generation of Irish-American men who had come of age in the decade after the famine. He was a man who took notes. This was, in itself, unusual enough among mining men that his colleagues remarked on it. He carried a leather-bound notebook, small enough to fit in his coat pocket, thick enough to hold months of observations. And he used it constantly, recording the dimensions of rock faces, the angle of ore intrusions, the temperature and air quality at different depths of the shaft, the discrepancies he noticed between what he observed and what the official maps of the mine's workings depicted. The discrepancies were, at first, what geologists would call normal minor variations between the idealized picture that a map represents and the actual irregular reality of rock under the earth. Rock does not follow lines, or does not conform to the angles at which engineers draw it. A certain amount of divergence between map and reality was expected and unremarkable. But the discrepancy that Fahey found in the late summer of 1879 was not the ordinary kind. He hired on at the Standard Mine, and within 6 months he was a shift foreman, a significant advancement for a man without local connections. His supervisors, particularly the mine superintendent, a man named Calvin Pratt who had come west from Pennsylvania with a degree in mining engineering and who managed the Standard's operations with a combination of technical competence and political sophistication that kept San Francisco's investors satisfied and Bodie's miners from organizing, recognized Fahey's practical knowledge and used it. Fahey knew where the ore was. He had a gift for it that Pratt, for all his formal education, could not replicate. The problem was that Fahey also knew other things. In the early autumn of 1879, Fahey wrote a letter which has survived partially, because a portion of it was entered into a county proceeding that was itself only partially preserved, in which he described what he had discovered in the lower levels of the Standard Mine's eastern shaft. He did not describe it clearly, which may have been deliberate caution or may simply reflect the fact that he did not yet fully understand what he had found. But what he described, in the language of a man who chose his words with the deliberateness of someone who understood they might be read by hostile eyes, was evidence that ore samples from a particular section of the mine had been systematically underreported, not by accident, not by the ordinary slippage of record-keeping in a busy operation, but systematically, deliberately, in a pattern that, if Fahey's interpretation was correct, had been running for at least 2 years and had diverted a significant and as yet uncalculated sum from the mine's public shareholders to persons unknown. The letter was addressed to a lawyer in San Francisco who represented a consortium of investors who held shares in the Standard Mine. He received it. We know this because he later said so in a deposition. But he did not immediately act on it. And his explanation for the delay was that he wanted to verify the claims before bringing them to his clients. Patrick Fahey did not give him time to verify anything. On the night of October 14, 1879, Fahey was found dead in the alley behind the Occidental Hotel on Main Street. The official finding was that he had been shot during a robbery. His wallet and his watch were missing. And while the town marshal at the time opened an inquiry, that inquiry produced no arrests and was formally closed within 3 weeks. The San Francisco papers ran the story for 2 days. Then they ran nothing. What they did not run, what no paper ran at the time, although several journalists later claimed to have been aware of it, was the fact that Patrick Fahey had not been carrying his wallet that night. His landlady, a widow named Agnes Corrigan who ran the rooming house where Fahey had boarded for 14 months, told the inquest that Fahey had left his wallet in his room that evening because he had told her he was only walking to the assay office and back. She had seen him go. She had noted, as landladies note things about the men in their care, that he had seemed preoccupied, not frightened, she said, but the way a man seems when he is carrying something in his mind that is too large to set down. He carried nothing but his notebook. A small leather-bound notebook that he used for his geological observations. And that, unlike the wallet and the watch, was never found. The notebook. That is the detail that keeps appearing in the edges of this story, mentioned and then abandoned, the way a name keeps surfacing in a document that was not supposed to contain it. Corrigan told the inquest about the notebook. The inquest noted her testimony and moved on. The lawyer mentioned it in his deposition and then clarified, when pressed, that he had never seen its contents and could not speak to its significance. A mine worker who had been Fahey's closest associate at the Standard and who had been present at the eastern shaft the day Fahey made his discovery, testified before the same inquest that he too had seen Fahey take notes in that notebook on the day in question. He left Bodie 3 months after the inquest. He went to Oregon, and after that the record of him ends. The notebook was never found. The inquiry was closed. The Standard Mine continued operating. And in the spring of 1880, Calvin Pratt, the mine superintendent, fought his superior, the man with the engineering degree, purchased in cash a substantial house in San Francisco's Nob Hill neighborhood. The purchase price was recorded in the public property records. It was a number that did not align easily with a superintendent's salary, even a generous one. No one asked him about it publicly. No one seems to have asked him about it at all. The years between 1880 and 1882 were Bodie's apex. The Standard Mine alone produced millions in gold during those 2 years, and the town that had grown around it reached what contemporaries called its fullest and most terrible flower, a phrase used by a Methodist minister who arrived in Bodie in the summer of 1880 to establish a congregation and spent most of the next year writing letters home to his bishop that grew progressively more desperate in tone. His letters have survived in their entirety in the archives of the Methodist Episcopal Church. They constitute, inadvertently, one of the most vivid first-person accounts of Bodie at its peak, not because the minister was a particularly skilled observer, but because he was a man who was genuinely shocked by what he saw and had not yet learned to moderate his shock for an audience. He described the streets at night as a continuous corridor of noise and ruin, in which the light from 60 doorways makes a kind of counterfeit noon, and men pass through it in states of intoxication so profound that they appear to be navigating not a street but some internal landscape of which the rest of us can have no conception. He described the cemetery on the hill above town, Boot Hill, though he refused to use that name, as filling at a rate that troubled him not only morally but practically. There was, he wrote in October of 1880, beginning to be a problem of space. He was not wrong. The Bodie Cemetery records, which are more complete than most of the town's surviving documents, list 273 burials between 1877 and 1882. Of those, 61 were attributed to gunshot wounds, of which 49 were ruled homicides and 12 were classified as accidents. Another 37 were attributed to mining accidents. 18 were attributed to freezing, which in the context of the era meant any death resulting from exposure to the extreme winter conditions, temperatures that regularly fell below zero and stayed there, winds that came down off the mountains at speeds that blew men off their horses. 23 were attributed to illness, a category that covered everything from pneumonia to the various symptoms that in the 1880s traveled under the name of fever without further specification. And the remaining, a category that the record keeper simply labeled cause undetermined, numbered 41. 41 people buried in Bodie between 1877 and 1882 whose cause of death was listed as undetermined, lost in a town where the coroner was also the town dentist and the town's most active gambling parlor operator, and where the coroner's official seal appears on documents that sometimes contradict each other in their descriptions of the same event. Undetermined could mean many things. It could mean what it said. It could mean the death had been determined, but the determination was inconvenient. It could mean that no one with authority had looked carefully enough to form an opinion. Among the 41 was a man named Dario Licchetti. Licchetti was Italian, born in the Piedmont region, arrived in California in 1875, spent 2 years working in the hydraulic mining operations in the northern Sierra before coming south to Bodie in 1877. He was a laborer, not a skilled miner, which meant he did the physical work of breaking and hauling rock, rather than the technical work of assessing and directing it. He worked for the Bodie mine, not the Standard, and his employment records there are among the more complete surviving documents from the period. He appears in those records as a reliable and uncomplaining worker who received periodic wage increases and never filed a grievance. He also appears, and this is where his story becomes less ordinary, in the private account book of a man named Samuel Obergfell, a merchant who operated a dry goods store on King Street and who maintained, in addition to his business ledger, a second and smaller notebook in which he recorded personal debts, favors, and what he called, in his ornate mid-century German script, matters of weight. Obergfell's second notebook was discovered in 1923 in the back room of a building in Bridgeport, California, by a woman who was clearing out property that had belonged to her deceased uncle. She gave it to a local historian who transcribed the portions of it before the original was lost. And those transcriptions are held today in the collection of the Eastern California Museum in Independence. In September of 1881, Obergefell's notebook records a conversation with Lichetti. The record is brief. Obergefell was not a man who wrote at length about things he found uncomfortable, but its contents are specific. Lichetti had told him something about the Bodie mine's lower tunnels, and something that Obergefell describes only as the matter concerning the Chinese workers and the passage they were made to use. What Lichetti had told Obergefell, apparently, was something more specific than the general conditions of Chinese labor in the Bodie mine. He had told him about a particular passage, a particular use of a particular passage. And whatever that use was, it had troubled Lichetti enough that he had told Obergefell, and it had troubled Obergefell enough that he had written it down in his private notebook under the heading Matters of Weight, and then had evidently done nothing about it. Because the next entry in the notebook concerning Lichetti simply records his death. Dario Lichetti was found dead on the morning of March 3, 1882, at the bottom of a shaft in the Bodie mine's eastern section. The shaft was one he was not assigned to work. The foreman's report states that he must have wandered into the area by accident in the pre-dawn darkness. The shift began before sunrise in winter and fallen. The depth of the shaft was sufficient to ensure that the fall itself was the cause of death. The coroner's determination was accidental death. It was recorded as undetermined in the cemetery records, which may indicate a clerical error or may indicate something else. But the discrepancy was never investigated. Obergefell noted it in his private book. He wrote, "Lichetti is dead. The matter he described is now, I think, beyond my ability to pursue. I will say no more of it here. He never did. The decline of Bodie did not happen all at once. It happened the way all such declines happen, in phases, each of which felt, to the people living through it, like a temporary setback rather than the beginning of an end. The ore grades at the Standard and the Bodie mines began dropping in 1882, not precipitously, gradually, the way a tide goes out, so slowly that you don't notice it's gone until you're standing in mud. By 1883, the population had dropped by half. By 1885, it had dropped by half again. The saloons began closing, not all at once, but one by one, the ones with the highest rents going first, the ones on the edges going next. The fire of 1892 destroyed most of what remained of Bodie's commercial district. It started in a building on Green Street in the early morning hours of a July day in conditions of low humidity and high wind that made it effectively unstoppable once it reached the adjacent structures. 63 buildings burned. What burned in 1892 included the office of the Bodie Free Press, which had been the town's newspaper during the peak years and had, in the course of its publication, accumulated a library of back issues, correspondence, and unpublished materials. All of it was gone by morning. A historian from Berkeley named Marcus Aldrich, who had been studying Bodie since the mid-1920s and had visited the town multiple times to photograph and catalog surviving structures, wrote in a letter to a colleague that the 1932 fire had destroyed several items he had previously identified as potentially significant, including, he mentioned with a particularity that suggests he had thought carefully about what he was saying, the contents of a locked room in the Standard building that I had been unable to gain access to and that the owners had refused to allow me to examine. By the 1940s, Bodie had dwindled to a population of fewer than 20 people. The last full-time residents left around 1942, driven out by a combination of wartime labor demands and the simple mathematics of a town that had no economic reason left to exist. The buildings remained. The wind kept moving through them. The winters kept doing what winters at 8,300 feet always do, settling into the wood, working at the foundations, finding the cracks. The state of California designated Bodie a state historic park in 1962. The official designation uses the phrase arrested decay to describe the preservation philosophy, which means the buildings are maintained in the condition they were found, allowed to continue their slow deterioration without restoration, stabilized against collapse, but not renewed. It is, when you think about it, an unusual approach to preservation. The acknowledgement that something is falling apart is combined with the decision to let it keep falling apart, just more slowly. In 1938, nearly 60 years after Fahi's murder, a journalist from Sacramento named Bernard Holt came to Bodie as part of a project his paper had commissioned on the ghost towns of the California interior. He spent 3 weeks there, longer than the assignment required, staying in a tent at the edge of the town site because the buildings were already considered unsafe for habitation. What he did during those 3 weeks we know primarily from two sources: the article he published, which was thorough and accomplished and said nothing remarkable, and a notebook he kept which was not published and which was found among his papers when he died in 1971. His daughter, in settling his estate, found the notebook and read it. And because she was a careful woman who had grown up watching her father choose his words, she recognized that it was different from his other notebooks, more careful, more deliberate, written, she later said, as if he thought someone might eventually read it who wasn't supposed to. Holt had found the secondary passage, not the passage itself. The physical shaft had partially collapsed by 1938 and the section Fahy had accessed was inaccessible, but Holt had found something else. A set of documents wedged into the wall of the Standard Mine's old administrative office behind a section of paneling that had partially detached. The documents were damaged by moisture and age but legible in their substance. They were internal company memoranda written in the 1880s, discussing what the writer, whose identity Holt says he could not definitively establish but who was almost certainly the mine superintendent based on the authority the writer claimed, called the secondary accounting. The secondary accounting was exactly what Corrigan's letter had suggested Fahy had found: a parallel record of or extraction and processing, maintained separately from the official books, recording the movement of high-grade material from the eastern shaft through an unmarked passage to a separate processing facility. The memoranda were not confessional, they were administrative. They discussed quantities, schedules, personnel arrangements. They discussed the men who operated the secondary facility and what they were paid for their silence. They discussed what happened when the arrangement was threatened. They did not use Patrick Fahy's name. They used a construction that Holt in his notebook transcribed with a directness that suggests he had no doubt about its meaning: the matter of the employee who had been conducting unauthorized surveys of the eastern section, and in a subsequent document, the resolution of the employee matter. The resolution, as if Fahy's death were a budget line, as if a man's murder were an administrative outcome. Holt's notebook records that he spent 2 days after finding the documents in a state of what he called something between fear and calculation. He was aware, he wrote this explicitly, that the men who had authorized the resolution were dead. Pratt had died in 1914. The other names that appeared in the documents, the men who had managed the secondary operation on the ground, had died in the years between. There was no living criminal to expose. There was no case to make to a prosecutor. There was only the history, the fact of what had happened, the mechanism by which a man had been killed and his discovery buried, the 40 years during which the Standard Mining Company had continued to operate and its officers had continued to prosper, and the shareholders who had been defrauded had never known they were being defrauded. What Holt calculated in those 2 days was whether publishing that history served a purpose proportionate to the risks of publishing it. The men were dead. But they had families. The Standard Mine had been absorbed into other entities, which had been absorbed into others still, in the way that mining concerns always moved capital through successive corporate containers. There were people, he did not name them in the notebook, who had a financial or reputational interest in the matter remaining buried. And there were people in positions of authority, again unnamed, who he had reason to believe would prefer that the story not be told. He published the Ghost Town article. It was well received. It said nothing about the documents. He took the documents with him when he left Bodie. He kept them for 33 years until his death. His daughter found them with the notebook. She read them. She put them back. She told one historian in a conversation in 1979 that she had decided to let her father's decision stand, because he had lived with it longer than I have and he knew things I don't. She died in 1994. The documents and the notebook were part of his estate, which was handled by an attorney whose records are not publicly accessible. Whether the documents survive and in whose possession is not known. What is known, what the documented record, partial and fragmented as it is, allows us to say with confidence is this: Patrick Fahy found something in the Standard Mine's eastern shaft in 1879 that threatened powerful men. 3 weeks later, he was dead. The notebook in which he recorded his findings was never recovered. The men responsible for his death died wealthy and respected. The company that employed them continued operating for decades. The fires of 1892 and 1932 destroyed much of what remained of the administrative record. A journalist found evidence of the fraud in 1938 and chose not to publish it. The evidence passed out of public reach and has not been seen since. And beneath Bodie, in the eastern section of the Standard Mine, in a shaft that has never been formally assessed for structural safety, the stated reason for its closure, there is a passage that appears on no official map. It is still there. The rock doesn't burn. Today Bodie receives approximately 200,000 visitors a year. They walk the wooden boardwalks of a town that stopped in 1942 and has been stopping ever since, slowly, incrementally, in the way that things stop when no one decides to stop them, but no one decides to maintain them either. The Standard Mine headframe still stands on the hill above town. You can see it from the main road as you approach, rising against the eastern Sierra sky with the particular silhouette that mining infrastructure has, functional, angular, stripped of any attempt at beauty. The park's interpretive materials describe Bodie's history in terms of boom and bust, of human ambition and natural forces, of a town that rose quickly and fell just as quickly and left behind a lesson about the transience of wealth. The materials mention the violence in measured terms, noting the high rates of death, the 65 saloons, the reputation that kept respectable families away. They mention several of the documented killings, the famous ones, the ones that made the papers and became part of the town's mythology. They do not mention Patrick Fahy. They do not mention Dario Lucchetti. They do not mention the 41 people buried in the Bodie cemetery under the designation cause undetermined. The state of California maintains Bodie in arrested decay. The phrase is apt in ways that may not have been fully intended. Decay arrested, caught in the act, stopped before it could complete itself, held in a condition of permanent incompleteness, where the ending is always approaching, but never arrives. The buildings lean. The wind works through the gaps. In winter, when the tourists are gone and the roads are impassable and the town returns to the silence it had in the decades before anyone arrived looking for gold, the only sounds are the ones the wind makes and the ones the settling timber makes as the cold contracts it. The Standard Mine headframe stands above all of it. It has been standing for 140 years, through the fires and the winters and the slow departure of everything and everyone that once gave it a reason to stand. Below it, the eastern shaft descends into the dark. The passage goes where it goes. The chamber at the end of it, if it is still there, holds what it holds. Some things, once buried, resist excavation not because they are unreachable, but because the people with the power to reach them have decided, generation by generation, that the cost of what they might find is greater than the cost of leaving it where it is. What do you think really happened in that eastern shaft? Do you believe everything about Bodie has been told? Or is there a version of this story that no one has been permitted to tell? Leave your comment below, ***. And if you enjoyed this and want more stories like it, stories where the horror is real because the people were real and the choices they made were the choices that people actually made, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this with someone who thinks they know American history. There are always rooms we haven't looked in yet, ***. We'll see you in the next one.